We have with us today some of the leading minds in the field of education.
Indeed we do, Jeremy. And moderating the conversation is founder of the Business Plan for Peace and the Oxford Research Group, 3 times Nobel Peace Prize nominee, Dr. Scilla Ellsworthy.
And joining her is Director of UNESCO's Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Education for Peace and Sustainable Development, Anantha Duraippah.
Oh, co-founder of One Young World, Kate Robertson, as well.
Yep, and Afua Nkuza Asamoah, activist and member of Children's Youth Advisory Board for Project the Shame.
We are also thrilled to have with us the well-known Kenyan photojournalist and political and social activist, Boniface Mwangi.
Senior Vice President of Scholastic National Partnerships, Amos Hayes.
And Dr. Howard Taylor, Executive Director, End Violence Partnership. Panelists, thank you so much for being with us. Scilla, over to you.
Hello, we're here for a discussion on the crucial role of education in establishing peace and ensuring humanity's survival. We've got a brilliant panel here with you, and we're going to steer you towards essential educational tools, materials, and practical ideas. And between us, we're going to reach a deeper understanding of how education can create a more peaceful and sustainable world. So what we're going to deal with during this session is the best way to achieve peace everywhere, and that's to reduce violence everywhere. So let's cut violence in half by 2030. Today, we start the countdown to achieve the most significant reduction in global violence in history, inspired by the global goals. The decade of peace starts now. Violence is holding us back. It's time to come together around a commitment to halve global violence by 2030 to build a better future. The evidence is in. We know how to prevent violence. Leaders at all levels can and must play a part to step up political will and action to halve global violence by 2030. And preventing and reducing violence and investing in peace is a sound investment. Halving global violence alone could save up to $2 trillion by 2030. 36 national governments are already in, 16 cities and over 100 businesses, NGOs and champions already committed to halving global violence by 2030. What will you do to contribute to this decade of peace? So here we are. The global countdown to halve global violence in 10 years starts now, this day, on Peace Day, the 21st of September. And in 2020, we have only 10 years to do it. Just to give you a couple of key statistics. 1 in 6 people worldwide were victims of violence in 2019. 1 in every 2 children worldwide experience violence every year. 1 in 3 women globally face some form of abuse each year. And up to 82,000 people each year are killed in conflict. 600,000 people were killed in 2018, and the vast majority of those in cities. So it's my great pleasure to welcome our wonderful speakers. And the first person I'm very delighted to welcome is Kate Robertson. She's the co-founder of One Young World. And Kate, the first question I'm going to put to you is, do you agree that education is the single most important factor in building long-term systemic change towards a more peaceful, sustainable world? If so, why is this?
I do. And here I'd like to limit these remarks to the big numbers that you cited around armed conflict around the world, to point out the following, that in education all over the world, particularly of school children, and let's face it, that's where it starts and where we become acculturated to the way we're going to think for our lives. The history, the story of armed conflict is always taught from one side only. Depending where you are and where you're being schooled, you will be taught either the story of your own side or the story of the victor. So if you look at it like that, then you realize that we live out on a daily basis, Santayana's law, that we are condemned as humankind to armed conflict for the rest of our lives. So this acceptance that we have all had of the way history is taught, so education, the way that education is used, the way history is taught, that we are taught one side from one point of view, can only lead to one result. No one ever sees both sides. Therefore, there is no path, no possible path to conflict resolution until it becomes so serious that both sides collapse in a heap, and then you start conflict resolution. So you have to look at education and say, think, everybody on this call, think about the way you yourself have been taught history. Were you taught from both sides of any one of those conflicts? If so, great education model, but it starts with that thing.
Kate, this is really putting us in context. Can you actually add to what you've said by pointing to some examples where progress in education is actually leading to tangible change to achieve peace?
So the example that I chose for you, Scylla, today was to look at the path that led to the peace process and the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
When we had One Young World in Dublin in 2014, I had to go on a big lesson there with Senator Martin McAleese of his 7 steps to reconciliation. And the way he tells it, he talks to you as though you as an individual have got a gripe or a conflict with another individual. And what does it take you to start this path? And I couldn't do it. I could get in my head someone who I wanted to punch in the face, and I couldn't get myself to go, I'll walk down the corridor. And Martin's lessons, so the lessons of Northern Ireland, and they are well documented. And there are a lot of books that have been written that could be taught in schools about these are the things that you're going to have to do. And the first lesson I learned when we were there was the way we had to tell the story of Northern Ireland to our delegates from every country in the world. You can't assume they know the story. Why should they? And how anxious both sides in Northern Ireland were that they would choose, that we would choose a neutral storyteller, which hadn't even occurred to me. The story had to be told. So they had one person from the side of the Unionists, the Protestants, one side from the side of the Republicans, the Catholics. They each told their story, and then a neutral storyteller put it all into its facts and frames, and then the conversation was allowed to carry on. But what were we learning? We were learning how big the sacrifices had been made on both sides, and also that there was a way out of the violence, that there was an end, that it was possible, that this endless cycle of retribution that you see in the conflict zones around the world, where it just bubbles up again and again. Once people see, as they now have in Northern Ireland, although the violence flares a little bit every now and then, this is a country that has learned that both sides have to tell their story and start to acknowledge that actually, you know what, we could talk to each other. This enmity need not continue. But education is this framework, and there is no reason for history to be taught in our schools the way it is taught in our lifetime. It's still being taught the same way. There's absolutely a point where you go, don't teach history. Teach conflict resolution. So don't learn the battle dates. Teach conflict resolution. Will it be perfect? No. Is it going to be 100% further down the path than we are today? Yes.
I love the way you put that, and it's fresh from real experience. If I'm not mistaken, when Senator George Mitchell, who came to help us move towards the Good Friday Agreement, when he got off the plane, he said, "I will listen for as long as it takes." And in my experience, teaching children to really listen and hear what's coming towards them, and then even read it back to those that might not agree with them is a vital element. Would you agree with that?
I would absolutely, it's absolutely vital. And the thing that we are not taught, and to me the really shocking lesson was that in conflict, any conflict resolution, violence resolution in the home, which I know Jeremy Gilley likes to talk about, is accepting that somebody has to lose out. Somebody comes to the table and loses out. Somebody at the table loses the power they perceive that they have today. And these things are hard, but it's like muscle memory. These things can be taught and learned and taught and learned. We are not taught that way. We are taught you're in it to win it, whatever it takes, and I will pulverize you until you can't get up. But when you find a way, you'll come back and you'll pulverize me. And so we carry on. And you have to look at our human history and go, our generation, and go, have we learned nothing? Nothing?
Well,
Why?
You're certainly moving us on with this discussion. Thank you so much. Now I'm going to go to Dr. Ananda Duraiappah. Ananda is the director of the UNESCO Mahatma Gandhi Institute. And the first question I would have for you, Ananda, is all national education systems differ, but in general, what critical changes do you think are needed in terms of ethos, pedagogy, structure, curriculum, to equip a generation to ensure that humanity will survive? How could such major changes come about?
Thank you, Stella. It's a loaded question, actually, and it'll take quite a bit of time to address all of them. But let me put forward three suggestions. The first, I think we have forgotten, is what education's objectives are. I think when we look at our children, education should be fun. I never had fun during my education. It was always such a chore. So always exams driven. It was never really fun. It should be fun. It should be relevant. It should be curiosity driven, should be engaging, should be self-motivation and self-paced. So I think identifying what our objectives are really important. Is rather than looking at us just as a capital asset and sort of added as a human capital, we should look at human flourishing as the end goal for education. So that's the first one. Because the second, I would say, a curriculum which is based on a whole brain approach. The connection between the intellectual intelligence, the cognitive part of the brain, with the emotional intelligence. We tended to focus so much on the cognition part, we forgot about the emotions. And at the end of the day, our behaviors are so influenced by our emotions. Dan Ariely wrote a great book sort of saying, the irrationality of rationality. So it's something that we have to really address it. And one of the books that I found really engaging is Sapolsky's Seed in terms of the human brain, Behave.
Yeah.
Seat of hatred and violence is in our brains. But the good news is that passion and compassion is also, peace and compassion is also part in our human brain. And the thing is, the research is that we can train our brains in such a way that it can overcome that hatred and violence. What we call, we say, develop the Gandhi neural networks.
Yeah.
Talking about Gandhi is not enough. We have to learn how to live his life. He went through a whole life of experimentation, and that's what we have to do. And so here, this is what it's important to explore and find our own selves. This third is, let's get rid of those pesky standardized exams, things like PISA and TIMSS. It basically tells what Kate was sort of talking about. It creates a very competitive, predatory kind of nature within ourselves because we are put to compete against others. And I think what we should do is compete within ourselves. It is us as the benchmark rather than another. And that really creates a very predatory system. So let me conclude by saying, let's re-engineer the best predator training system to a nurturing system for the present and future generations.
I'm so glad you bring that into this question, Anantha, because it's absolutely vital that the whole person, the emotions, the body and the spirit, as well as the brain, are brought into education, as you've just said. If I can ask you an even broader question, how can the global community act, in your view, to end violence at home, online, and in schools? It's a huge question for you.
Let me start with the schools. I think one of the main things that we should do is try to mainstream social and emotional learning within our education systems. Mm. It's an attempt to create a subject on it, and I resist that quite well. I don't think it should be treated as a subject. It should be mainstreamed within the whole education system. It should encourage more of a home, school, community kind of activities. Have acts of kindness as part of the learning and the learning assessment exercise. And the good news is the return on investments. You know, if you talk to policymakers, they're sort of saying, hey, our budgets are already extended. You want to have more stuff into the schools. The return on investment on social-emotional learning, and this is well documented, ranges from 7 to 11. Those are really good returns. Any banker would just jump on it. And some of the early studies that we had done at the Institute shows that there's a twofold increase even in, I don't like to use this indicator, gross domestic product, but if you're talking to a policymaker who understands that language, investment in social-emotional learning does have such a large impact on our national income. The second one, I would say, is to join the Kindness Matters movement. This is something that we have started. Kindness is compassion in action. It's about taking empathy, and I was really happy to hear when Kate heard about listening and then putting yourself in the other's shoe. And that's the whole exercise of empathy training, is not to just sort of listen and then have your own perspective. It's to really to understand the other. Mm. I always say the power of what if, and you put yourself into that situation. And John Rawls did a really great understanding of what under the veil of ignorance. And he asked the question, what if? And when you ask that question, a lot of different outcomes emerge. So an act of kindness, maybe an International Day of Kindness, but not to have a day where we actually do acts of kindness, but to celebrate the kindness acts over the last 364 days and to acknowledge the positivism in this world rather than media always talking about the negative aspects, that people have this instinct to be kind to others, and we actually get a huge dose of these good, feel-good, what I could say, neurotransmitters. We feel good when we help others.
We do.
Jump. So let's do that.
Ananta, thank you for making that particular point about making us feel good towards others. Thank you very much. So now I'm going to go on to introduce Afua Nakansha Asmal. And Afua is a member of the ChildNet Youth Advisory Board. So Afua, you are most welcome. And my first question for you is, what role do you feel individuals can play in supporting education reform?
So from my perspective, I believe that individuals play a big role in supporting awareness campaigns when campaigns do come to the forefront. And that's because when certain campaigns are being done and people can actively support them, that means that the news and the information can get not only to the remit that they were trying to get to, but it can also get to policymakers, and it can bring real change in terms of education reform. And the most important thing is that it helps the children who need the change to happen. Like we've all heard, formal education is the place actually where most people get, especially in their formative years, they get to understand who they are. They get to start thinking for themselves and through the content that they're learning in their classrooms. And so certain campaigns do help us to achieve educational reform.
Thank you. That takes us into a deep area. I want to pursue that in a moment. But first of all, can you point to one or two examples where progress in education is leading to tangible change towards achieving peace?
Yeah. So I want to first say that education is very important to establishing peace. And I would like to use a quote by Mandela, who said that nobody is born hating another person, and that people must learn to hate. And if people can learn to hate, then they can be taught to love. And if we're using the language of hate, if we're using the language of learn and taught, then that means that education it comes naturally into that question. And therefore, we understand that education, even though a big chunk does happen in formal settings, education is also happening online. And I would like to say that on the online space, especially from a youth perspective, that is where a lot of content is being spread and a lot of things are being shared. And that is where people are also getting awareness of things that they wouldn't have otherwise learned in a classroom. So for example, I, as a youth advisor, I worked on a DeShame project, which was enabling we were trying to raise awareness on online sexual harassment among young people. And that is a peaceful solution to digital violence. And what is very important is that we're currently having these discussions online. And I mean, no one is people have gone to school now, but just for the past few months, people were having school online, and this is where the discussion was happening. So education does come in because influencers and content creators can do like a great job in actually educating young people. For example, when the protests happened during lockdown, we saw that there were so many young people who were involved in these conversations, and they were happening on various social media platforms. And that's like a different take on the traditional educational route. But people were learning about history instead of learning about them in the classrooms. People were learning about politics instead of learning about it in their classrooms. And that was a place where people could actually see more peaceful solutions in terms of going for peaceful marches, etc., etc. Another thing that happens online, especially with regards to raising awareness and with campaigns, is that people get heard. And as we know, children have the right to be heard. So some online spaces can be safe spaces where children and youth can grow, and they can learn, and they can be heard, and they can be understood. And that's one good thing about taking the conversation online as we currently are having them. And did you want to say?
No, go on.
Yes, so I think that is a very important perspective that we should not lose, especially coming from the I guess like the millennials and the younger generation. Some of these children are digitally native. They've just born and the internet was already there. So in terms of their formative years and some of the discussions that they're having since they were young, it's all been on that space. And so if we're having these discussions online and we're having and we're I guess promoting peaceful solutions online, that means that their outlook to life is a much more peaceful one, and therefore they can learn the right ways to do things, because that's where they've learned it. They've learned it online in a place where some feel safe and some feel heard.
That's really very moving what you're telling us, and I'm really glad that you've fed in particularly what's happening on social media that some people may not be aware of. Thank you so much, Afua. And now we're moving on to our next guest, who is Anne Umstruds-Hayes. And Anne is Senior Vice President at Scholastic. Welcome, Anne.
Thank you.
My first question for you is, all national education systems differ, but in general, what critical changes do you feel are needed in terms of ethos, pedagogy, structure, curriculum, to equip a generation to ensure that humanity will actually survive? How could such major changes come about? Big question for you as well.
It is, but what's interesting in what we've been hearing from my colleagues is that we're all addressing some very similar topics and coming at it in an incredibly similar way, despite the differences in location for all of us. And I think what we look at Scholastic and personally, the first thing and the most important thing that we can do to drive peace through education is actually valuing education above all else. If across nations we can support the education of everyone, rich, poor, boys, girls, young and old, we can drive economic growth, cultural understanding, sustainable government, and sustainable development, as well as empathy. And I think Anantha mentioned the importance of social emotional learning as we think about peace and education. It's so critical. But once we actually recognize the value of peace and of education in delivering peace, one of the things that we can do is actually shifting the most common pedagogy from teacher-centered learning to student-centered learning. And everyone has talked about the importance of stories, the importance of voice and being heard. Afua talked about the child being listened to and the importance of that we're seeing through social media. But if we can actually turn the classroom on its head, not necessarily changing our curriculum, but actually changing the aspect of this teacher as the lecturer into a student-centered model where we are creating a classroom of peace, and that the educator actually becomes a peace educator rather than just a lecturer, we have the opportunity for everyone's story to be heard, and to create a culture of peace in our classrooms. If we do this, we have the opportunity to not necessarily turn the curriculum on its head, as I said, but we can fundamentally change or integrate peace into our teaching by changing the fundamentals of reading, writing, math, science, all through the lens of peace. So as we teach children to read, we can be telling them the stories of others, the stories of people from different cultures, from different backgrounds, and they can build understanding through those stories. We can actually encourage them to tell their own stories so they feel valued, and again, creating that understanding that where they are valued, they can then begin to value others and value the experiences of others.
Just let me bring in a question from the chat.
Yes.
How would you suggest we give peace education to young people involved in violence, gang violence, crime cases? drug
Oh my.
gangs?
Well, you know, it's interesting that that question came in the chat. I have the benefit of working with some phenomenal colleagues at Scholastic. And one of my colleagues, Michael Hagan, is a former superintendent, a former educator, a former superintendent and principal in some of the most violent communities in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And he, in preparation for our conversation today, actually chose to speak with him about his experiences. And he talked with me about this idea of providing children with a opportunity in their classrooms to have a safe place, to have a peaceful environment where they are treated with respect, where their stories are heard and understood, and that the simple act of putting them in a situation, in an environment where they are trusted, where they are understood and valued, can literally turn their experiences and their lives around, not only in terms of their everyday work and the everyday experiences that they have, but also in terms of their education. The ability of creating a peaceful classroom to actually advance the work of educators and to move schools and students who have traditionally failed because no one is listening to them to a pathway of success where they can be heard and they can be successful.
I agree with you, and I'm sure it's really important that people involved in violence get the chance properly and facilitated to meet with the other gangs, people on the other side. So thank you very much for letting us have your insight on that. And now I'm going to move to Howard. Howard is the executive director of the End Violence Partnership. And Howard Taylor, your first question is, can you point to examples where progress in education is leading to tangible change to achieve peace? Who is walking the talk? Who can we learn from?
Thanks so much, Sila. This is a great conversation, so I'll try and be additive to that and talk a little more specifically about safe learning environments and the contribution they make to safety, security, and peace. We know we've heard some of this, but ending violence in schools drives multiple wins. That improves learning outcomes, it better leverages investments in education, and it begins to shift the social norms, which of course are critical to start to break the intergenerational cycle of violence within and beyond schools. And we know, as we've heard, schools should be places where children develop not just academic skills, but also learn about building healthy, peaceful relationships. I think Anantha mentioned social emotional learning, and learn right from wrong. But the situation we have at the moment is that too many schools are not yet modeling or equipped to model the safe, the peaceful, and the positive environments which we want to see elsewhere in society. I want to speak about the Safe to Learn initiative, launched last year to catalyze commitments globally and evidence-based action to end violence in and through schools by 2030. It's a joint initiative of the End Violence and the education sector, and it provides a platform and an opportunity to unlock those multiple wins that I just mentioned. It has a high-level political tool, which is a call to action, which sets out 5 evidence-based areas that we know if these things happen, schools can have a good shot with their communities and their children and young people of ending violence. There's around policy and legislation, improving the school's prevention and response to violence and abuse of children, beginning the conversation and starting to shift social norms in and around schools, effective resource allocation, which is really one for governments, for donors, for funders, and the sector that deals with education, and then of course improved data and evidence. And you asked me, Sarah, who's walking the talk? Well, 15 countries so far have endorsed the Safe to Learn call to action, and they go pretty much across every continent: Cambodia, Georgia, Jamaica, Jordan, South Africa, all sorts of examples. And I want to talk to just 3 of those because you asked for some specific examples: Nepal, Uganda, South Sudan. In those countries, with the support from UNICEF and the UK FCDO, they've done a benchmarking exercise to measure progress against those 5 pillars of the call to action, which I just mentioned, to better understand the gaps and challenges, and then for partners domestically and internationally to coalesce around those to provide the support and the resources that are needed. In Nepal, we are funding Mercy Corps, who are fostering safe and supportive educational environments. In that terms, it means supporting teachers' capacity on safeguarding and positive discipline and making sure that complaint mechanisms at the school and community level are in place and are robust. I just want to say briefly, though, this year of all years, of course, in the context of COVID-19, we know that the pandemic has disrupted learning for nearly all children. I think earlier this year, about 1.5 billion children were out of school, physically isolated at home, and facing higher risks of domestic violence and greater exposure to online abuse and violence because learning and leisure, of course, moved online. But a sliver of opportunity, I think, COVID-19 has also raised awareness of violence against children. And in doing so, I think the important role that schools play and education plays for children's health, their well-being and their safety beyond just the educational benefits. And what I see is COVID-19 prompting educationalists to begin to reimagine some aspects of learning. And I think that's an opportunity for us all to translate the audacious ambition of getting to zero violence in schools into a reality in every country. And what that's going to take is agreement on a small number of actions, I think, in most countries that will make a real difference and a step change in the advocacy, the action, and the investment needed to make that happen. And the Safe to Learn initiative I mentioned is one such platform to do that.
Oh, let me just ask you, Howard, which countries have you got your eye on to add to those 15 countries already in the Safe to Learn call to action?
I would like to see countries everywhere on every continent. So we have countries across 3 or 4 continents. I would like to see many more countries across every continent. This isn't just a them and us issue. This is everywhere. Violence against children is a pandemic in and of its own right. It's everywhere. Violence and abuse in schools, whether that's teacher on child on child, issues around the safety of going to and from school, or even schools which are attacked as part of conflicts. It's happening across the world. So really, Sila, it has to be everywhere. And I think our ambition has to be that audacious, because this is children we're talking about. And if we invest in them and the schools and that learning environment with things that we've heard of from other speakers, that's how I think we're going to see the generational change and the creation of a new normal, which is going to translate into peaceful societies in future.
Howard, thank you so much. I think this Safe to Learn initiative should be spread throughout the planet. Now going to move to our last speaker, Boniface Mwangi. And Boniface is a human rights defender. So Boniface, welcome. We really need loads of people like you.
Thank you.
My first question for you is, what role can individuals play in supporting children and their educational reform? How can the global community act to end violence at home, online, and in schools?
Thank you very much. That is a good question. I think one of the things we need to understand is that schools are built in communities, but communities don't see schools as part of them. What we need to do is find ways that the community owns the school and the school is part of the community. So a school is not a place that you go to, it's part of the neighborhood, of the fabric of the community. And when we do that, we get involved. The challenge we face as the world is that most of the curriculum in the schools are written by state actors, and there's very little involvement of the community. So the best way to actually create that ownership is that for a region, let's say Kenya or Uganda or Sudan or the US, a particular community should be able to come and say, for our community, what do you think our kids should learn in this particular moment or this particular stage is let's say, peace education, as I said. But the other thing I would like to say is actually people, when a community owns a space like a school, they ensure their books, they ensure there's a library, they ensure there's enough teachers, they spend their time and money. And I think the next road should be, how do we get individuals, alumni associations to actually come together and adopt a school in the community. So the school belongs to the community, and the safety in the school is the responsibility of the community. The problem we have is that we delegate the safety of our kids in schools to the government and the teachers. And so we delegate those things, but we shouldn't be doing that. We as the community and as parents should be able to do that. And I would like to add, as someone who went through school, and the curriculum wasn't good, and there was violence, I have a responsibility to fight to ensure there's no violence in my former school, and the curriculum is actually up to date. We normally try and bury our childhood trauma and say it's part of learning, it's part of life, and let our kids go through the same torture that we went through. We must say that the torture and the violence that we went through in school as kids should end with us, and fight to ensure that the schools in the community belong to us. The safety of the kids doesn't belong to the teachers or the government. It's actually our responsibility as the people who take our kids to school there. Now, for the online community and the global community, what can they do? I think the biggest space of violence right now is online. And there are companies that actually make money from those online platforms. We must ensure that these companies play a role in ensuring that violence is not glorified, bullies are actually banned from those particular sites, and guys who promote violence or purveyors of violence actually investigated, prosecuted, and jailed. Companies that make money from our data and make money because we join their networks must be held accountable when violence happens online. And companies that do not do that should be taken to social jail, which means you say company X did not do their work properly, or they are not protecting minorities and kids on those platforms. So this company belongs to this social jail, and you shouldn't do business with it. You shouldn't work with them until they put safety measures to ensure everyone is safe. So the idea of trying to pass on the back and no, people need to police themselves. No, a company that has a platform online has a responsibility to ensure that that space is safe for everyone. And they can
I'm so glad you add this point about violence online. It's an essential one. I've just got one last question to ask you. It's a big one. Do you agree that education is the single most important factor in building long-term systemic change towards a more peaceful world? Why is this, if you agree?
Yes, I agree. There cannot be a better world without education. Proper education gives you knowledge and skills for meaningful work, and also the emotional and the social intelligence to avoid violence. So the key to preventing violence is to ensure people are well educated. Countries that actually invest in education and make it a birthright, and they invest in good education, actually has less violence. And those countries actually develop very well. If you look at the countries that lead in violence, you'll see there's a correlation between education and the good education and less violence. And where there's no education, there's more violence. And even if you look in the US, in states that has not good investment in education, there's high violence, and there's more young people in jail, and you have more problems. So the truth is, we as the custodians of the future, we must ensure that all the kids, wherever they are in the world, have good education. If the money that the US government spent fighting Taliban was spent on education, the country would have actually progressed. If the money my country or Uganda spent in buying jet fighters and buying tanks and doing war, if that money was spent in education, the country would be far better. So a country will progress depending on how much they invest in education, not in the military, not in the police, not in prisons.
I'm so with you in taking the money out of defense budgets, military spending, and putting it into education. Now it's my job to try and sum up what these brilliant speakers have said, and I can never attempt to do that. What I want to do is to try to leave you with some of their main points that I've made notes about. I love the lessons from Northern Ireland that Kate brought in, and about the importance of listening that really came to the fore in Northern Ireland. And then going on to another, talking about the whole person, how we bring together the emotional, the bodily sense of the person, and the spiritual aspects of education. And he introduced the notion of kindness and how much kindness matters, leading to compassionate action. And then afwa, wow, she said something I'll never forget. If children can learn to hate, they can be taught to love. And she's devoting her life to raising awareness amongst young people, particularly using social media. And kids have a right to be heard. I think everybody really made that point. And then when we moved to Anne, she was talking about the importance of moving to student-centered learning, providing violent kids with a safe and peaceful environment. And Howard, I loved his call to action on Safe to Learn. That's already reached 15 countries and will reach more, I'm sure, as a result of this broadcast. And lastly, Boniface. He was saying this key thing that countries must own the school in their community and make it safe. And then he turned to the issue of violence online. And Kate in the chat said, a platform online means responsibility for the content. So I don't know how we sum up the key issues better than enabling everybody to listen to the recording of what these exceptional speakers have contributed today. And we're really delighted and grateful to all of you. Thank you to everyone.
Wow. Well, that was one of the most important conversations we could be having on Peace Day. Thank you, panel, for such an exceptional dialogue.